member for Vancouver Mount Pleasant.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have to say this is an extremely moving day for me. And the last time I think I was this emotional, I should say, that I could recollect in this very chamber was in fact when the government of the day had the former and late Chief Joe Gosnell stand at the bar and address this very assembly on a very similar issue, Madam Speaker, and that was to address and for us as legislators to acknowledge historical wrongs against the Aboriginal community and to make changes going forward. It is my honor to collectively bring forward and support the motion to reconcile a long and ugly chapter of British Columbia's history today. And I'm particularly moved that so many people are gathered here around this chamber to witness this very historic moment, some of whom have firsthand experience of this discrimination that was brought about in British Columbia from so many years ago. Some of them survived it and with their children thrived in those difficult conditions and have economic success, cultural contributions to the multicultural fabric of our society, made a path for those of us in the younger generation to follow, so that we as a society, as a whole, can build a better British Columbia. The motion before you, Madam Speaker, as the Premier had stated, as the Minister has stated, and as the Leader of the Official Opposition stated, reflects a collaborative effort for which I thank the Minister for inviting the opposition, the independent members, the member from the Green Party, to work with her on the wording of the motion. Chinese and Indigenous people are the two oldest non-European people in British Columbia. The earliest record showed that the Chinese were in British Columbia dates back to 1788, when approximately 30 to 50 Chinese shipwrights built the first European-type vessel in Nootka Sound. Chinese presence in BC was significant and began to grow, and according to the 1881 census, the Chinese population in BC was 20% of the non-Aboriginal population, a percentage higher than even now. And so imagine for a moment what it was like for 20% of the population to be repeatedly told that they're second-class citizens and to have their human rights and their right to fully participate in society denied. BC passed legislations that said, and I quote, "Every Chinaman, Japanese, Hindu, or Indian is disqualified from voting in provincial elections." And where the Chinese were tolerated, it was in the context of accessing cheap labor. In the words of our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, and I quote, "It is better to have Chinese labor than no labor at all. At any moment, when the Legislature of Canada chooses, it can shut down the gate and say no more immigrants shall come here from China. And those in the country at the time will rapidly disappear, and therefore there is no fear of permanent degradation by a mongrel race," end quote. The history of British Columbia is replete with examples of discrimination based on race. Many discriminatory practices were codified in law, and the sheer volume and the extent of these laws is breathtaking. From 1872 to 1928, in almost every session of the House sitting, racist laws were passed against the Chinese community and other non-white communities. This amounted to some 89 bills, along with 49 resolutions and 7 reports. 2 resolutions from the Committee of Supply authorized expenditure related to these discriminatory laws. And there were numerous motions, questions, efforts made by private members to propose further laws to entrench the discrimination against the Chinese, the First Nations, and frankly, anyone else who is not white. There is no question that the intent behind these discriminatory laws was to fulfill what the former Premier of British Columbia, Sir Richard McBride's declaration that, and I quote, "British Columbia shall be a white man's province," end quote. BC's racist laws reinforced and created social, cultural, and economic inequality. These laws perpetrated hatred and mistrust of the Chinese communities and other ethnic communities alike that caused untold suffering and humiliation. Some of those stories were told in the forums. Some of those stories were told privately amongst family members and between friends. Some of them have shared their stories with me in this very chamber. As I hear their stories, my heart ached. Some of the people in this very chamber work with those communities to build a better life. And some of those sitting in this chamber continue to work with newcomers so that they can achieve the hopes and goals and dreams that they aspire to when they immigrated to this land. Our history tells us that the first people of this land, the Aboriginal peoples, along with the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Indo-Canadian communities, did not have their fundamental right to participate in a democratic society. For the Chinese, it wasn't until 1947 that we were afforded the right to vote. For the Aboriginal community, the very first people of this land, they were not allowed to vote until 1949. But the racism did not stop there, Madam Speaker. Did you know that in 1893, BC passed an act to provide for the establishment and maintenance of provincial home for the aged and infirm, and in practice, they barred the Chinese from admission to such provincially established homes. These are what we now call hospitals, Madam Speaker. And it was because of this history that the beloved Mount St. Joseph Hospital was established. Many of us in the Chinese community calls the Mount St. Joseph Hospital the Chinese hospital because it was built from a time when the Chinese were prevented from accessing healthcare services in hospital, and a group of nuns came and established the Mount St. Joseph Hospital to serve the Chinese community. From 1894 to 1924, a leper colony called Darcy Island, a remote patch off of Vancouver Island, became the prison to the Chinese across Canada that suffered from leprosy. Their only outside contact was in every 3 months, a supply ship would come and dump food and clothing, including coffins, on the island. The dying were to bury the dead. The non-Chinese people with leprosy were cared for by nuns and a resident physician, along with a cook in a hospital. That is our history. And there's a period where Chinese students, Madam Speaker, were segregated from the general population, all simply because they were Chinese. And during the Depression, 100 Chinese men died from starvation. And in 1934 and 35, the BC government sent several hundred Chinese back to China with the agreement that they stay there for at least 2 years. Why, you may ask, Madam Speaker? This was to cleanse BC of, and I quote, lunatics and Orientals. The Chinese were prohibited from buying Crown land. The provincial government forbade them to enter into the province. They were excluded from working in certain industries, not allowed to enter in certain professions, and even after death, they were segregated, and burial records listed them as, and I quote, Chinaman number 1, Chinaman number 2, and so on. Madam Speaker, this is just a sampling of the laws and practices that discriminated against the members of the Chinese community and other members of the non-white community. The discriminatory laws and practices prevented members of the Chinese Canadian community from participating fully and reaching their full potential. The effect of such legislation fueled episodes such as the 1907 anti-Asian riots that caused injury and destroyed property in Vancouver's Chinatown. It is tragic that governments of the day tapped into racist sentiments and even campaigned on it. A 1935 Vancouver Sun newspaper revealed comments such as, and I quote, "A vote for any CCF candidate is a vote to give the Chinaman and Japanese the same voting right that you have. A vote for a liberal candidate is a vote against Oriental enfranchisement." This came from a source from our archives. There is no question that legislators of the day played the worst kind of politics. Fellow human beings were devalued based on the color of their skin. They rally hateful sentiments towards a group of individuals based on their race for political gain. And in looking back, we see such actions as repugnant and disgraceful. But today, in 2014, we are moving forward, Madam Speaker, with the motion that was introduced by the Premier and with a vote that I know will come from this House, where every single member of this House will stand in support of the motion. Many of the members in the community, those who sit here today, those who are not here today, have called for steps to be taken to reconcile our sordid past. And in the past decade, different levels of government and administrations of different political stripes have finally come forward to acknowledge some such historical wrongs. In 1992, the BC Legislature unanimously passed a motion calling on the Government of Canada to consult with the Chinese Canadian community to provide a reasonable redress for families impacted by the Chinese head tax. In 2006, the Conservative Canadian government made a formal apology for the Chinese head tax and offered symbolic compensation to head taxpayers. Closer to home, New West Minister Council issued a formal apology in 2010 to Chinese Canadians for the discriminatory practices of its government and elected officials. Madam Speaker, there is no question that for apologies to have meaning, that it must be done with respect, sincerity, and genuine apologies are crucial to building trust and providing hope for the future. That is a reflection of all of our values as a society and our aspirations as a province. And today in this chamber, I am so honored and so pleased to say that we have achieved that goal, Madam Speaker. The motion being brought forward is supported by everyone. I know that. And I'm equally pleased that the Minister of International Trade and Multiculturalism added legacy initiatives as part of the reconciliation process. Because reconciliation does not start or end with an apology. It is an ongoing process where we must continue to learn from these past mistakes, that we must continue to educate the public about the history of our past, that we must own this history, and then from there to go forward. And the reconciliation process also means that the hope and represents the hope of the future of what our society could become. I have to take a moment and just to recognize the founder of the Canadians for Reconciliation, Bill Chu, for his long advocacy for a meaningful reconciliation process for Chinese historical wrongs. Since 2009, he has called for educational curriculum changes, got the BCSTA to endorse a motion that he brought there on the floor on educational curriculum changes with respect to Chinese historical wrongs. He's also pursued the preservation of historical artifacts and sites and done study tours across the province with students and visitors alike to say to all of us that we must do more to preserve this history. He has consistently and continuously worked tirelessly to educate the public about this important history and the need for proper reconciliation. There are scholars in this chamber who has documented this history, who studied this history. A friend of mine, Dr. Henry Yu, who's contributed so much, who will continue to contribute. And I know in speaking with him, he says, I'm not quite ready to retire. And I'm so glad he said that, because there's much work to be done. And the reconciliation process and the legacy initiatives is going to need his help and many others. I see others who are sitting around the chamber, and I'm just somewhat reluctant to name them all by name, because I know that I would run into trouble with all of that. But I do want to pay a special tribute to our veterans who went to war without being recognized as Canadians and survived it to come back to tell the story, to give us hope for the future of what our society ought to be. And they... To all of our veterans, we thank you, because you have given us the opportunity to be better today. And in going forward, Madam Speaker, I will continue to work with the government, with the Minister of International Trade and Multiculturalism, with the independent members, and with my colleagues to pursue this dream that we all share from so many years ago. To say that reconciliation does not end with an apology, to say that legacy projects will continue, to recognize the clan associations who so many years ago, I don't even know how they managed to do this, but managed to build clan associations to service the Chinese community who were being discriminated against because they were segregated from accessing service, from housing, from meals, from anything that you would call a normal life. They existed to support the Chinese community then. Many of those societies are now aging. Some of it in its physical structure, some of it in the board members that are part of it. And I want to work with the minister and every member of this House towards the preservation of these clan associations and the legacy and the history that they presented, and to bridge that history intergenerationally, to make it relevant today, and to provide a service that's relevant in our communities today, including the option of building housing on top of these society buildings, providing meal programs to the seniors, not just for the Chinese, but for every community in a multicultural society that we have today, as an example. And I look forward to engaging in that process as the government commits to embarking on a needs assessment in that regard, and hopefully to actually realize the legacy initiative that was submitted to the government through the government's consultation process. If we do that, and if we do all the things that is said in the report that the minister has tabled, and in the hearts of all of us in this chamber today, we have something that is so, so tremendous and historical that we should be so very proud of, that we can say to the rest of the world that where British Columbia has become, where Canadians have now achieved, and that we will be an example to the rest of the world of things that they could aspire to become. So I am so very honored and so very humbled to have this moment in time to speak to this motion, to do what little that I can to contribute to this process, and to continue this important work, so that for the next generation and for the people who come and will sit in these chairs after us, will no longer have to agonize over this history, but to simply to look forward into the future. And as my colleague, the leader of the official opposition says, the children of today's generation, when they see people, they don't see color. They only simply see people, a human race, united as one. I thank you for your time, for listening to me, and I look forward to seeing the motion pass in this House and to celebrating and thanking each and every one of you for all of your efforts and your hearts and your contributions in building British Columbia, a proud province that we should now, and we all now, call home. Thank you.